Ladies and gentlemen, let me tell you something most people won't do. Attraction doesn't fade because of distance. It fades because of weakness in your frame. Emotional distance isn't your enemy, it's your test. And only the emotionally intelligent, strategically dominant version of you can convert that space into magnetic pull. Today, I'm giving you 6 key principles that will turn emotional distance into irresistible attraction. Not with games, with power. Ladies and gentlemen, let me tell you something most people want to. Attraction doesn't fade because of distance. It fades because of weakness in your frame. Emotional distance isn't your enemy, it's your test. And only the emotionally intelligent, strategically dominant version of you can convert that space into magnetic pull. Today, I'm giving you 6 key principles that will turn emotional distance into irresistible attraction. Not with games, with power. When someone begins to pull away emotionally, your instincts scream at you to do something. Reach out, fix it, make them feel closer. That instinct is the very thing you must learn to resist. Because here's the hard truth. The moment you start chasing, pleading, or trying to close the emotional gap too quickly, you flip the polarity of attraction. You become the pursuer. You become the one waiting for crumbs of attention. And that isn't how you create desire. That's how you destroy it. Turning emotional distance into attraction starts not with action, but with stillness. Not silence out of fear or passive aggression, but silence born from power. You don't move first. You don't flinch. You let the silence hang. You let the distance do its job. Because in that space, something essential is happening. The balance of power is shifting. Most people don't realize this. Distance isn't the death of connection, it's the forge. It tests what was real and what was just convenience. It separates emotional dependency from true magnetism. When someone takes space, it doesn't mean you've lost value. It means you now have an opportunity to demonstrate your value without uttering a single word. If you react with panic, they sense it. If you react with overcommunication, they feel your desperation. But if you stand still, grounded, unaffected, you signal strength, not arrogance, not indifference, but the calm confidence of someone who doesn't fear loss because they don't need to be chosen to validate their worth. That energy is rare, and because it's rare, it's magnetic. Emotional distance is attractive to the degree that it creates uncertainty. But the game changes when you become the source of that uncertainty. When you're not scrambling to reassure or reconnect, the question that starts to form in their mind is, why aren't you chasing? Why aren't you trying harder? That question is where the spark reignites, not because you manipulated them, but because you broke the cycle of predictability. Most people lean in too much when they should lean back. They try to fix things when they should let tension breathe. Attraction isn't constant connection. It's ebb and flow, pressure and release, intimacy and space. You need the polarity to spark desire. If you eliminate the distance, you kill the charge. So you wait, not passively, but purposefully. While they pull back, you lean into yourself, into your goals, your circle, your mission. You don't watch your phone. You don't stalk their social media. You don't write 100 drafts of the perfect message. You live fully. Boldly, unapologetically, because that kind of energy cannot be faked, and it cannot be ignored. You become the person whose absence is felt. You become the standard against which they measure their silence. And when they do return, and they usually do, it's not because you dragged them back, it's because they felt the difference. They felt your detachment not as cruelty, but as a confident boundary, a declaration that you don't beg for presence. You command it. And here's the final truth: the person who can sit with the silence longest wins. Not in a game-playing way, in a psychological reality. Emotional distance can be terrifying, but only to those who haven't built the internal stability to hold their ground. You want to turn distance into attraction. Then become the kind of person who thrives in space, who doesn't chase reassurance, who knows that the highest value isn't in convincing someone to stay. It's in showing them you're unfazed if they go. That kind of presence is unforgettable. And that kind of energy, that's what pulls people back in. When emotional distance shows up, most people see it as a threat. They start panicking, assuming something is broken or wrong. The truth is, emotional distance isn't the end. It's an invitation. It's a moment that reveals who leads and who follows, who maintains frame and who collapses into needness. The mistake people make is thinking they can fix that distance by filling it with effort. They chase harder, talk more, try to prove themselves. But attraction doesn't live in overexposure. It lives in controlled presence. If you want to shift emotional distance to attraction, your first task is simple but difficult. Do nothing. You don't text to check in. You don't ask, "Are we okay?" You don't offer emotional confessions to pull them back. You hold your position. not to play games, but because you understand your value is not up for negotiation. People are drawn to what feels emotionally stable. When you don't rush to close the gap, you tell them, subtly but powerfully, that you are grounded, that you don't operate from fear, that you don't need constant validation to know your worth. That stillness creates tension, and tension, when managed properly, creates attraction. It's in that quiet, calm energy that people start to feel your absence. Not because you begged for attention, but because you stood still with the kind of presence that commands attention. This is where most people fail. They get uncomfortable with silence. They misinterpret distance as rejection when it's really an opportunity to lead emotionally. People remember those who can hold their center because it's rare, and in the chaos of emotional push-pull, rare becomes desirable. Once you've mastered that initial stillness, the next layer is subtle influence. You don't want to just endure the distance, you want to convert it into attraction. That happens by becoming more compelling in your absence than most people are in their presence. When they take emotional space, you fill that space with energy that grows, your lifestyle, your direction, your self-mastery. You don't freeze your world waiting for their return. You accelerate, you refine, you rise. Because here's the paradox: people are most attracted to those they fear they could lose. Not because of threats, not because of manipulation, but because those people live with momentum. And emotional distance feels different when it's happening with someone who's thriving. What you're doing here is flipping the frame. They may have initiated the space, but you're controlling what happens inside it. Most people get lost in waiting. You make them wonder what they're missing. You make them question if they're being forgotten. You shift their position from the one who detached to the one who now has something to re-earn. And when they do come back, and they will if attraction still exists, they return not to the same you, but to a stronger version. A version who didn't just tolerate the space, but used it to level up. That kind of energy doesn't just reignite attraction, it deepens it, because it shows maturity, confidence, self-respect. At the end of the day, emotional distance will always reveal the truth. Either it's the start of detachment, or it's the spark of renewed interest. What decides which one it becomes is not how loud you speak, how often you reach out, or how available you make yourself. It's how powerfully you can sit in the silence, how boldly you can continue building yourself while they hesitate. Emotional distance doesn't shrink those who understand it. It sharpens them. And it draws others in, not because they beg to be seen, but because they became impossible to ignore. Emotional distance is a trigger. It awakens our insecurities, our craving for control, our need for certainty. But what most people fail to understand is that this discomfort isn't a signal to act, it's a signal to evolve. When someone creates space between you and them, the worst thing you can do is collapse into it. That instinct to reach out, to fix, to pull them back is rooted in fear. Fear of abandonment, fear of not being enough. But when you operate from fear, you lose all leverage. You move from power to pleading. That's when attraction fades, because no one is drawn to desperation. They're drawn to calm, to presence, to confidence. When emotional distance appears, the person who can breathe through it, without flinching, without scrambling, immediately becomes more attractive. Because in a world where everyone reacts, the one who remains still stands out. What keeps that stillness from becoming passive or weak is what you do with the silence. While they pull back, you move forward, but not toward them, toward yourself. Emotional distance is the perfect test of personal gravity. If your world stops spinning because someone steps back, your frame was weak to begin with. The point is not to pretend you don't care. The point is to care correctly, to channel that energy inward. You take that time to sharpen your focus, refine your life, upgrade your mission. Not as a performance, not as a manipulation, but because that's what high-value people do. They don't sit around waiting to be chosen. They choose themselves. And here's the part people miss: when someone senses you haven't paused your life, they pause their affection, it creates tension. The right kind, the kind that pulls them back in with curiosity, with longing, not because you begged, because you didn't. You let the space speak louder than words ever could. Then comes the third layer, emotional contrast. This is where you seal the transformation. You don't just tolerate emotional distance, you use it. You create polarity, not through conflict, but through difference. They pull back, you go brighter, you become more joyful, more engaged, more alive, not in relation to them, but in your own life. You create moments, share glimpses of them, move with intention, because contrast creates interest. If they're cold and you go cold, nothing happens. If they're cold and you try to be overly warm, it feels forced. But if they're emotionally neutral and you're quietly vibrant, you generate intrigue, not attention seeking, not over the top, but subtle signals that say, I am unshaken, I am in motion, I am worth missing. That's what stirs the attraction again, not emotional pressure, but emotional polarity. They feel the distance, but now it's their discomfort, not yours. So many people waste emotional distance trying to get back to where things were. But power lies in not wanting to go backward. You're not rebuilding the same dynamic, you're resetting it terms. When they come back, they return to a different version of you. One who didn't chase. One who grew in the silence. One who understands that emotional distance is not rejection unless you treat it like one. It's a mirror, a filter, a crucible. And if you pass that test with presence, power, and self-respect, you won't need to fight for attraction. You'll become the gravitational center of it. Emotional distance often feels like rejection, but in truth, it's a psychological opportunity disguised as discomfort. When someone pulls away, it's easy to internalize that as something you did wrong or something you need to fix. That's the trap. The moment you buy into that narrative, you start giving away your power. You become reactive. But emotional distance isn't the enemy. It's a natural tension that reveals who truly understands attraction dynamics. If you try to smother the distance or erase it with constant communication, reassurance, or emotional validation, you disrupt the exact space where attraction could have rebuilt itself. The smarter move is to allow the distance to breathe, not out of apathy, but because you're confident enough to let tension work in your favor. You understand that attraction grows in absence, not in overcrowded emotional spaces. The more you resist the urge to close the gap impulsively, the more powerful your position becomes. This is where your emotional discipline is tested. Anyone can act strong when things are easy, when they're getting love, attention, and validation. But real strength shows in silence, in how you respond to being ignored, in how you carry yourself when connection is uncertain. Do you collapse into anxiety, or do you channel it into becoming sharper, more grounded, more magnetic? That's where the shift happens. If you can resist the chase and instead redirect your energy into your own path, your mindset, your goals, your body, your environment, you not only hold your ground, you elevate it. And here's what that does psychologically: it shifts their perception of you. People notice when they expect you to break and you don't, when they expect you to reach out and you stay composed. You don't disappear, you evolve. You don't beg, you build. That subtle shift from reaction to redirection creates curiosity, and curiosity is the seed of renewed attraction. At this point, you have to leverage emotional contrast. While they are withdrawing, you must become more vibrant. Not loud, not desperate for attention, but alive. You want them to feel a gap, not just in presence, but in energy. That doesn't mean faking joy. It means doubling down on your reality. You show life moving forward. You invest in your world with such intensity that their emotional distance begins to feel like a disconnect from something valuable. This isn't about revenge or proving anything. It's about signaling one simple message without saying a word. I am becoming more, not less. And that emotional contrast is powerful. It creates friction in their narrative. They start to wonder, why aren't they chasing me? Why do they seem even more grounded now? Am I losing something I underestimated? That's when the emotional dynamic begins to tilt. Not because you manipulate it, but because you held yourself with more conviction than most people are used to. Finally, you must maintain the frame when they do circle back. And if real attraction ever existed, they often do. It's crucial you don't fall back into the previous pattern. You're not welcoming them into the same version of you they left. You've changed the frame. You've raised your standards, clarified your boundaries, and strengthened your emotional posture. That doesn't mean you become cold or distant. It means you now engage from a place of inner strength, not emotional dependence. You don't punish them for pulling away, but you also don't reward it with instant availability. Keep your center. You don't reach, you respond. And only if it aligns with your truth. Emotional distance isn't just a test of patience. It's a blueprint for personal growth. Handle with power, and you don't just restore attraction. You rebuild it on stronger, smarter, unshakable ground. When emotional distance begins to appear, your natural instinct is to reach across it, to close the gap and restore connection. That instinct feels urgent because you associate closeness with safety. But acting on that impulse is often the very thing that kills attraction. The truth is, emotional distance doesn't have to be the end. It becomes destructive only when you respond to it with fear. When someone pulls away, what they're often doing, consciously or not, is testing your emotional frame. Can you hold your position without falling apart? Can you remain calm without demanding answers or begging for reassurance? The more you try to fix, explain, or chase, the more they lose the feeling of tension that attraction thrives on. Instead, you must do the opposite of what feels comfortable. You hold still, not in passive silence, but in active control. You become the person who can sit in the space without folding under its weight. The second key is mastering the energy of redirection. You take the discomfort of that emotional gap and you reroute it. Instead of using your energy to win someone back, you use it to build yourself forward. This isn't some hollow self-help slogan. It's a tactical shift. The emotional charge that comes from feeling pushed away is powerful. Most waste it by obsessing, checking messages, replaying conversations. But if you flip that energy inward, you can create momentum that actually makes you more attractive. You go to the gym harder. You focus on your goals with more intensity. You socialize not to make someone jealous, but to reconnect with your life force. And what starts to happen is subtle. Your energy shifts. You're no longer trying to convince someone to return. You're becoming someone who naturally draws others in. Because growth, focus, and presence are magnetic. Once you've stabilized yourself and redirected your energy, you begin to introduce the third layer of emotional differentiation. This means that you don't match their coldness with coldness, nor do you meet their withdrawal with emotional flooding. You remain warm but uninvested, friendly but detached. You show presence but without pressure. This is the art of calibrated energy. You don't shut down, you simply reduce the supply. You don't overcompensate. You don't explain yourself unnecessarily. You let them feel your absence without weaponizing it, and this quiet strength makes you stand out. Most people either go full ghost or full desperation, but emotional differentiation creates a middle space that's infinitely more powerful. It keeps you unpredictable, composed, and slightly out of reach. Next comes the shift in psychological position. Emotional distance often begins because the dynamic has grown stale or unbalanced. But when you don't chase and instead start shining in your own lane, the polarity begins to reverse. They start to feel uncertainty, not because you're playing games, but because you've genuinely detached from needing them. That's when the attraction reawakens. When someone feels like they're no longer in control of your emotional state, their mind re-engages. You are no longer responding as expected, and this creates friction. Friction is not the enemy. Predictability is. By breaking the expected pattern, you stimulate curiosity. That curiosity leads to re-engagement, not always immediately, but consistently. It creates movement. Finally, the re-entry point, if it comes, must be handled with clarity. You don't simply welcome someone back into the same emotional space they left. If they return, it's to a more elevated version of you, someone who didn't freeze, someone who grew. That return must meet your new standard. You're not cold, you're clear. If the distance changed you, then your interaction must reflect that. You don't need to punish, but you must protect your value. This is how emotional distance becomes attraction. Not by waiting, not by pleading, but by transforming space into power and silence into strength. Emotional distance is a mirror. It reflects back not only what the other person is doing, but who you become in response to it. Most people see it as a loss of connection, a signal that something is slipping away. That fear drives them to react, over-explaining, reaching out, over-investing emotionally in an attempt to pull someone back. But attraction doesn't respond to pressure. It responds to energy. And the moment your energy becomes needy, anxious, or overly available, you dissolve the very tension that creates desire. The key is to reframe emotional distance not as a problem to solve, but as a polarity to master. The person who can stay grounded while the other pulls away holds the frame. And whoever holds the frame leads the dynamic. That leadership isn't loud or forceful. It's silent, composed, and deeply attractive. Your first real move isn't toward them. It's inward. You turn the emotional heat of the situation into fuel for presence. Not pretending to be unbothered, but becoming actually centered. You remind yourself that someone pulling away doesn't define your worth. You begin to show yourself that you can still live, move, and expand without their immediate closeness. And this is where people get it wrong. They believe the more they show care and prove their intentions, the more likely the connection will be restored. But genuine attraction doesn't need to be explained. It needs to be felt. And people feel most drawn to those who don't collapse under uncertainty. Instead of chasing comfort, you hold your emotional line. You give space without coldness. You show calm without detachment. This blend of warmth and control is rare, and that's what makes it potent. With your emotional baseline in place, the next key is redirection. You take all the thoughts, doubts, and energy you were projecting onto them, and you reinvest it into your own life. It's not enough to just wait. Waiting is passive. You must build. You must create a sense of inner movement. You move toward your goals, into your fitness, into your creative power. your social value, your spiritual clarity. You don't use it as a performance to provoke them. You do it because your focus is your most valuable asset, and attention directed inward is transformation. It's what keeps your energy attractive. People don't want what's available. They want what's evolving. When they see you not holding your breath, not pausing your growth, something inside them shifts because that's not expected. That's not what most people do. And that contrast becomes irresistible. The fourth key is tension management. You need to understand that attraction needs space the same way fire needs oxygen. The mistake people make is smothering the tension. They want resolution too quickly. But when you allow the space to remain open, you create the possibility for them to feel the difference. Silence becomes your signal. It says, I'm not chasing and I'm not waiting. I'm moving. It's not withdrawal. It's boundary, not manipulation. It's clarity. Most people can't handle that. They rush in trying to solve, to secure the bond again. But the one who allows the silence to breathe longer holds emotional leverage. You are not afraid of distance. You know that true attraction either survives the space or dies honestly in it. And either outcome reveals truth. Eventually, if attraction still lives, they will begin to re-engage. That's when the 50 comes in frame protection. When they return, they may test the waters. They might not dive back in right away. That's where you stay centered. You don't rush to restore the old rhythm. You respond, not react. You allow interaction, but on your new terms. You show that emotional access to you is no longer automatic. It's earned. That doesn't mean being difficult. It means being deliberate. If the distance didn't teach them anything, you don't return to old dynamics because you've grown. And with that growth comes a new standard. You're not cold. You're clear. The final key is reinforcement through embodiment. This is when the distance has either resolved or clarified the connection. And you keep moving in your strength regardless, because emotional power isn't just for hard moments. It becomes your default. You no longer fear distance because you've learned to convert it into attraction, not through games, but through self-command. That kind of emotional posture doesn't chase love. It attracts it, earns it, and holds it without needing to cling. That's real magnetism. So how do you turn emotional distance into attraction? By refusing to shrink, by refusing to explain, and by radiating unshakable presence. Attraction doesn't live in needness. It breathes in mystery, strength, and direction. Control the frame, and you don't need to chase anyone. They'll circle back because they'll feel the gravitational pull of something rarely unavailable to fear, unapologetically magnetic. Want me to tighten this up into a performance script or add a version for women as well?